Darks? Flat darks? Dark flats. Dark darks. Bias? Where's that can of worms? Alright, let's get into it. Welcome to SETI Astro. I'm not even really sure how I should approach the subject totally, considering the range of my audience from very new people to very experienced people. So I'm just gonna jump into it. If it seems like I jump around a little bit, just follow along. So what you see on the screen now is a typical 15-minute dark exposure, highly stretched here so you can see it, of an IMX492 sensor. These are a fairly popular mono sensor out there, and what you're seeing are all sorts of things. There's hot pixels in here, there's Nyquist thermal noise in here, there's dark current, there's amp glow, just a lot of things in a dark frame. And here is a typical flat frame. You'll see like vignetting in the corners, maybe a big dust mote here in the middle. And it looks like just like a global correction that we're going to be doing for all this. So I think we need to jump in first and talk about what we're correcting in the first place, and then clean up confusion around darks, dark flats, whatever you want to call them, in bias frames. So back before ZWO made the ASI 071 color camera, these chips were actually found in DSLRs like my Pentax K5, and the landing field did a great tutorial on how to convert yourself to do a full spectrum conversion. There's plenty of companies that do this as well, but they went into a lot of detail, and I had actually passed this information along to ZWO prior to them ever making that camera. And I'm hoping that I had a small part, along with other enthusiasts that wanted a chip like this incorporated into their cameras. A little less than a year later, they came out with it. So this is a typical sensor with a Bayer matrix on it, so a color camera. Zooming in quite far on the sensor itself, now you could actually start seeing the matrix of pixels, the little sensor pixels that actually make it up. And this is the things. These are the things that are going to be collecting the photons for us. Continuing to zoom in, this is when they were actually in the middle of modifying their camera and stripping the Bayer matrix off. So what you see down here is the actual Bayer matrix. They're micro lenses on top of a dye printed substrate, which is the color filters. So just like you'd print CPUs or GPUs or any of those things, they're all in this dye printing. That's how they print the colors, actually just printed on the substrate. And you can see the bare mono pixels up here now, and then down below there's the hump of the micro lens and the actual color dye that's below it. And then really looking at a cross section here, the micro lens is this bubble on top. The color filter is this layer here. So if you have a mono camera, you don't have this color filter. And then below that, in this pink trough, is where the photon comes in and actually interacts with the substrate down here in order to free up electrons. The yellow is the pixel pitch, or how big, like when you see the size of the pixels in the descriptions, that's this yellow area. And then the blue area is actually the actual photodiode area in there. So the light does funnel in, and then the active photodiode is at the very bottom and is smaller than the actual pixel pitch. But this should give you an idea of what's happening at the pixel level. Then this image is from FSU. They have a great write-up as well on CMOS sensors, but it's what we were seeing, right? There's the micro lens on top, there's the color filter substrate that's printed over the whole thing, and then below that you actually, depending on the construction, right, depends on where these transistors are and everything, and then the potential well down at the bottom. So when we're correcting our images, what are we doing? You know, you're tempted to think when you do a thing like flat field correction, or your flat correction, it's a very global thing you're doing to your picture, since, by eye, this looks like a very global phenomenon on the sensor, right? It's the big vignetting across it. And then in comparison, if your sensor doesn't have amp glow, you may be thinking, well, I don't need to be taking these long darks. Certain other YouTubers said I could just take some bias and call it a day. Let's talk about what dark correction and flat correction is doing. It's not a global correction, even though it looks like it. It is a pixel calibration for your sensor, pixel by pixel. So again, I'm just going to be using the 294 sensor as an example. When you're getting a camera, a lot of the time you'll see charts like this. Now what we're really looking at are these things down here called read noise, and then there's usually another chart that's called dark current versus temperature. And these are sources of noise, right? So dark current are the number of electrons per second per pixel generated as you're exposing. So this is just random electrons getting excited due to the thermal noise, and they're mimicking photons. And then the other with read noise, it's a similar thing. When the well is red and the electrons are stripped from it, there's noise associated with those transistors turning on and off. And on average, that's what this is showing you there. How many additional electrons on average potentially are generated during that transition period of actually reading it due to the transistors switching. And a lot of the time you'll see a jump around unity gain, and that has to do with the programmable amplifiers in there handling reading a little bit differently. Now let's go back to the example here of the darks. So here's the master dark. This is a stack of 64 15-minute darks. And let's just zoom up in here and pretend we're a pixel. Now it doesn't look like a global phenomenon anymore. Right? These are pixels that are different for that length of the dark exposure. Now when you're dark correcting your image, per pixel, this is what the dark is trying to correct for, right? Each pixel is going to have a different amount of thermal noise it's associated with it, right? It's built a little differently. It may get a little warmer than the pixel next to it. It has a different amount of read noise when you're reading it out, right? The substrates aren't exactly alike. It's in a slightly different spot on the sensor. So even on sensors that claim they don't have any amp glow, there's still some glow inside that sensor. And depending on where it is, it may be collecting some photons from that. Per pixel, just exposed to nothing, each one is going to be different than the next. And when you do a dark subtraction per pixel, you're calibrating your image with that. Again, here's a flat, right? And you may be, again, tempted to think this is a global phenomenon we're correcting for, but we're not. We're correcting per pixel how much the sensor at that pixel responds to a uniform illumination field, right? So depending on your optical train, more photons are going to reach different areas than others, and each pixel is going to respond a little bit differently. And you can see even on a uniform illumination, pixels next to each other may be a slightly different sensitivity to the other, right? There's inconsistencies just across the substrate, such that some will be more sensitive to photons than other for the same voltage across it. So per pixel, you're recording and calibrating your image on the sensor's response to a uniform illuminated field. Now let's talk about actually just correcting the image really quick. So your image you take is going to be the signal from the sky, plus all this dark stuff, right? The dark current, the read noise, thermal noises in there. Like there's a lot of different noise that actually goes into just when it's illuminated to nothing, amp glow. We'll talk about bias in a second, but if you just go ahead and take your image divided by a flat, The flat has its own dark noise and stuff in there. And then there's a little correction here just to normalize it. What you end up getting is not the image signal divided by the flat signal. Going back to your math from school, right? You have your signal on the top plus some constant stuff. And then you have the flat signal on the bottom plus some constant stuff. Well, x plus c divided by y plus c is not the same as x divided by y. It's not the same as the image signal divided by the flat signal. So we have to remove all this other stuff, right? In the end, we want our signal to be corrected for all of it. So when we go ahead and do dark subtraction on an image, now I have two equations here. They ultimately lead to the same thing. If you take a dark subtracted image and you subtract off the dark frame that you took, that's going to be the sensor dark plus whatever sensor bias was in there for that dark frame. And you also took a series of 0-second dark exposures. Most people call them bias. They're not bias on CMOS sensors. We're going to talk about that. You end up just subtracting off all the same stuff and you're left with the image. That's exactly the same as if you just took the image, which is the image plus the dark stuff plus the sensor bias, and subtracted off your dark frames you took. So for dark subtracting the image, bias frames are meaningless. They were used back in the day if you wanted to scale your dark, if they were taken at different times and temperatures and all this other stuff. Meaningless on CMOS sensors of today. Your flat, on the other hand, has all those same things. So here's our flat. You're going to want to dark correct your flat. So you dark correct the flat the same way. You take a dark of the same exposure as the length of your flat, and you subtract it off. So all that sensor stuff for the darks and bias and stuff, it just all goes away, and you're left with the flat. I hate using the phrase flat darks or dark flats or whatever. They're all darks. Maybe that's where some confusion comes in. They're all darks. If you have blocked all the light going to your sensor and you take an exposure in there, that's a dark exposure. Period. End of sentence. Even if it's 0 seconds long, it's a dark exposure. And again, at the end now when you go ahead and do your division, you have your dark subtracted image now, and you divide that by your dark subtracted flat. Now you get your final flat corrected image, which really was what you were hoping to get, the image signal corrected for the flat signal. All right, now that we got the phrase flat dark and dark flat out of everybody's mind, they're all darks. Let's look at a product sheet for like the IMX492 sensor and see what's in these modern CMOS sensors. So here's the Sony IMX492. It's the same sensor regardless of who manufactured the camera you bought it in. It's the same sensor. And it's these data sheets that tell manufacturers how to utilize them. This is just the summary data sheet, right? The full data sheet would have a lot more. But what you're going to notice is on the chip, it has something called CDS and PGA. This is important because all modern CMOS cameras have this. So CDS is correlated double sampling, and PGA is programmable gain amplifier. What the heck is that, and how does it pertain to our discussion? So we've been talking about noise. This is just a little visualization of length of time versus your pixel getting exposed. So at the bottom, there's just some random fluctuation noise. It's always above the baseline. Photons come in, excite some electrons. Maybe it was dark current, electron got bumped up. The signal jumps up and it kind of fluctuates around that value there. And then you read it. Reading it is the point of the green arrow here. That's where the electrons are physically removed from the well and counted. Now that introduces a bit of noise right here. That's read noise. And the voltage drops back down in the well, fluctuating around wherever it was where it left the peak here will be where it kind of leads off and then starts fluctuating. Now, if we just took a 0-second exposure, there would be no signal. There would be no signal, right? It's going to be random fluctuation. You're going to read it, and it's going to be that same random fluctuation at the end. Back in the day, with old CCD sensors, that was called your bias frame. It's this fluctuation, which is dependent on a number of factors in there. You're reading that fluctuation, and then you're going to get the average of them because you're going to stack a bunch of them. For that pixel, what's the average amount of fluctuation that you read every single time from it? Right? This is going to give you the bias offset for that single pixel. And this is where correlated double sampling comes into play, or even on more expensive ones, there may be correlated multi-sampling. But what it does, and depending on the manufacturer, will depend on the front or the back end of where it does it. But most sensors, when it reads the electrons out of the well, that's the reading the signal, it will immediately take another sample at that pixel. So they're correlated. It's back to back to read that bias value for that pixel at that moment. And it does the subtraction right there on the sensor. So modern CMOS sensors with CDS already at the sensor level subtract the bias off. That's why I say a 0-second dark exposure is a dark. It's not a bias. The bias was already subtracted off. Everything you do with the cap on the camera with CMOS sensors are darks. So that CDS removes at the sensor level per pixel the bias. The other thing, that PGA will take the values of those two signals and actually do the subtraction on the column levels. So that's where the PGA comes in. It's programmable gain amplifiers. Now, depending on the manufacturer, if they only do them on columns and not rows, you may end up with banding. And we do see this on some of the modern Astro cameras out there. There's almost like row defects, and that's just due to the sensor not having both row and column PGAs to handle the correlated double sampling. So let's put it all back together. When asked if I agree that you could just take some bias frames and call it a day, the answer is a resounding no for me. They're not bias frames. First, again, let's just get that out of our vocabulary. Let's also get out of our vocabulary flat darks, dark flats, dark darks, whatever. They're all darks. And the reason I say it's a no for me is each pixel is what we're calibrating here by both taking darks and flats. Darks per pixel is going to calibrate that pixel for their response to absence of input energy. That could be read noise, thermal noise, differences in voltage fluctuations. If your sensor has amp glow, right, there's photons coming in from that. There's a bunch of things besides amp glow per pixel you want to correct for. And then again for the flats, you're correcting per pixel that pixel's response to a uniform illumination field. Some pixels are going to be more sensitive than others. Right, same with on the darks. On the darks you get hot pixels and cold pixels. Same thing with flats. There's going to be pixels that are more sensitive than others. It's important to do these calibrations because you're calibrating per pixel. You're not calibrating your image on a global by the eye look because there's some vignetting in the corners. Right? If you want to get the deepest, darkest, dimmest stuff that you're exposing out in your sky, you need this. That said, if you're taking some quick exposures, is it fine to just take some 0-second darks and calibrate it that way? Sure, right? Like we're all in this hobby to do what we want in this hobby. Go for it. Tell me to go pack sand and do what you want with all this information anyways, right? But at the end of the day, we're spending a lot of money on this equipment. We're spending a lot of time exposing the night sky to get a good image, to see what's out there. Why not take the extra time? Shoot a library of darks. Take your flats. Calibrate your flats with darks as well. Dark libraries can last quite a while on modern CMOS sensors, 6 months or a year. Take them once or twice a year and they're good for that period of time. Flats you got to take more often. Dust might be floating around in your optical train or on your filters or whatever. I personally feel to calibrate per pixel on your images, the best thing to do is a full set of darks and flats with the proper amount of time and temperatures and gain settings, and everything needs to be matched. So, little bit of a rant of a video. I'm hoping this cleared up some stuff for some others. feel free to open the can of worms down in the discussions. I'm sure there's going to be some backlash here. Please like, comment, and subscribe.